Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into Sisu, Road to Revenge, a brutal, stripped-down war revenge film that doesn't waste time explaining itself or holding your hand. This is the kind of movie that drops you into a frozen post-war world and expects you to survive alongside its main character. I went into this sequel curious, but cautious, because the first Sisu set such a savage tone that following it up felt almost unnecessary. But surprisingly, this film doesn't try to outdo the original with louder chaos. Instead, it deepens the pain, the silence, and the stubborn will of a man who simply refuses to die. What we get here isn't just another action sequel, but a continuation of trauma, memory, and unfinished revenge that lingers long after the bullets stop flying. Set in 1946, Sisu Road to Revenge opens in a Europe that technically has peace, but emotionally feels just as violent as the war itself. And this backdrop immediately gives the story a heavier weight. Finland has lost Karelia, borders have shifted, and people like Atomi Korpi exist in a world that no longer has a place for them. Atomi is no longer chasing gold or survival. He is chasing closure. One of the most striking images early in the film is him dismantling his own family home, plank by plank. Not out of necessity, but out of devotion. Every log feels like a memory, every nail a reminder of the life stolen from him during the war. This quiet act says more about his character than pages of dialogue ever could. He isn't rebuilding for comfort. He's rebuilding to keep his family alive in some form, even if it's only through wood and silence. The film's pacing here is deliberate, almost slow, but it works because it allows the grief to settle before the violence inevitably returns. You can feel that Atomi knows peace won't last, and the film smartly lets the audience sit with that dread. Once Atomi crosses into Karelia, the story shifts from mourning to pursuit, and the tension immediately tightens. The Soviet presence isn't portrayed with grand speeches or political explanations. Instead, it's cold, procedural, and threatening in a very real way. When the Red Army becomes aware of Atomi's presence, the film introduces its central antagonist, not with a dramatic entrance, but with a promise of freedom. Igor Dragunov, the man responsible for murdering Atomi's family, is released from a Siberian prison with one simple deal: kill the man who refuses to die. This decision alone frames the film's central conflict perfectly. Dragunov isn't motivated by ideology or patriotism. He's driven by survival and cruelty, which makes him feel disturbingly human rather than cartoonishly evil. The irony is painful. When Atomi and Dragunov finally cross paths and Atomi spares him, unaware of who he truly is. That moment is quiet, almost gentle, and it hurts more than any gunfight because the audience knows the truth long before Atomi does. From there, the film transforms into a relentless chase, but it never loses its emotional grounding. Every ambush, every explosion, every body left behind feels less like spectacle and more like the unavoidable consequence of dragging the past into the present. As the pursuit escalates, the action becomes harsher and more inventive, but never flashy. Atomi isn't portrayed as invincible. He's wounded, exhausted, and visibly breaking down physically. Yet he keeps moving forward, because stopping would mean surrendering to loss. The bomber sequence, where he and his truck are driven off a cliff into the ocean, feels almost mythic, as if the film is actively testing whether death itself can claim him. What makes this sequence powerful isn't the explosion or the fall, but what follows. Atomi doesn't emerge roaring back for revenge. He crawls back together, salvages the remains of his destroyed home, and turns them into a raft. This moment perfectly captures the film's theme. Survival isn't about strength, it's about stubbornness. Even when stripped of weapons and direction, Atomi adapts, using memory and pain as fuel. The discovery of the derelict tank later on pushes this idea further, turning instruments of war into tools of escape, even when they fail him again. When he is finally captured by Dragunov, the film doesn't rush through it. The torture scenes are uncomfortable, not because they are graphic, but because they are personal. Dragunov's revelation that he murdered Atomi's family lands like a delayed explosion, recontextualizing everything that came before it. This is where the film truly earns its title, because revenge here isn't immediate or explosive. It's slow, boiling, and inevitable. By the time Atomi breaks free aboard the train to Siberia, the film has fully embraced its bleak, almost surreal tone. The confined setting heightens the brutality, turning each carriage into a small battlefield. What stands out is how little dialogue the film uses during these sequences. Atomi doesn't shout or taunt. He moves forward like a force of nature, reclaiming his knife as if reclaiming his identity. Dragunov, on the other hand, reveals his true nature by murdering his own handlers, proving that betrayal and violence are the only languages he understands. The introduction of the ballistic missile on the train could have easily felt absurd. But the film treats it with the same grim seriousness as everything else. It becomes less a weapon and more a symbol of how war never truly ends. Even when treaties are signed, the final confrontation between Atomy and Dragunov isn't about flashy choreography or clever one-liners. It's about endurance. When Atomy uses the active missile to end Dragunov, it feels less like triumph and more like release, as if the universe itself is correcting a long-standing injustice. The closing moments of the film bring the story back to where it began, rebuilding. Atomy returns to Finland, not as a hero welcomed with speeches, but as a man quietly putting his life back together. The offer of help from other Finnish men is subtle but meaningful, showing that while Atomy walks alone, he is no longer completely isolated. The film ends not with victory, but with continuation, reinforcing the idea that survival is an ongoing act rather than a final destination. Sisu, Road to Revenge may not chase box office records or broad appeal, but it succeeds in telling a focused, emotionally grounded story about loss, persistence, and the cost of refusing to die. It's not a film for everyone, but for those who appreciate raw, minimalist storytelling with brutal honesty, it leaves a lasting impression. The story truly begins to sink its teeth into the audience when Atomy Korpi crosses into Karelia, a land that no longer belongs to Finland, but still lives painfully alive in his memory. This territory is not just a geographic shift. It is emotional ground soaked in loss, silence, and unresolved grief. The film slows down here, allowing the weight of Atomy's past to press against every frame. He is not marching into enemy land as a soldier on duty, but as a broken man carrying the remains of his life, quite literally. The dismantled wooden pieces of his old family home sit heavily on the back of the truck, creaking with every uneven road, as if the house itself is resisting being moved again after already surviving war, displacement, and bloodshed. As Atomy drives deeper into Karelia, the environment becomes harsher and more hostile. Forests stretch endlessly, roads dissolve into mud and gravel, and the air feels thick with tension. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic monologues explaining his pain. Instead, the film trusts the audience to read his emotions through silence. His face remains carved in stone, but his eyes tell a different story, one of exhaustion, suppressed rage, and an unbreakable will to finish what fate keeps interrupting. The man who refuses to die is no longer just a legend whispered among soldiers. He is a moving embodiment of grief transformed into determination. The Soviet presence in Karelia is shown subtly at first. Small signs appear, abandoned checkpoints, rusted vehicles, and distant engine sounds echoing through the forest. This slow build-up creates an unsettling sense that Atomy is being watched long before the Red Army officially becomes aware of his arrival. When intelligence finally reaches Moscow that Korpi has crossed the border, the tone of the film shifts sharply. What was once a personal journey turns into a political and military problem. The Soviet leadership understands exactly who Atomy Korpi is. His reputation from the Winter War still lingers like a ghost they failed to bury. The decision to release Igor Dragunov from a Siberian prison is one of the film's most chilling moments. Dragunov is introduced not as a loud villain, but as a calculating predator who understands cruelty as a language. His release scene is cold and clinical, emphasizing that the Soviet system views him as a tool rather than a man. The promise of a pardon in exchange for killing Atomy feels almost ironic, freeing one monster to hunt another. What makes this decision especially disturbing is the revelation that Dragunov is the same man responsible for murdering Atomy's family during the war. This connection is not immediately revealed to Atomy, creating dramatic irony that fuels the tension for the audience. As Dragunov assembles a small squad to intercept Atomy, the film balances action with atmosphere. Their first encounter does not happen in a grand battlefield, but in the wilderness, where nature itself becomes a weapon. Atomy's survival skills shine here. He uses terrain, silence, and patience to dismantle the squad piece by piece. The action is brutal and efficient, reflecting his experience as an ex-commando. There is no hesitation in his movements, no wasted energy. Each kill feels less like revenge and more like an unavoidable consequence of crossing his path. When Atomy finally comes face to face with Dragunov for the first time, the scene is surprisingly restrained. There is no dramatic showdown yet, no explosive confrontation. Instead, Atomy spares Dragunov, unaware of the truth. This moment adds emotional complexity to the story. The audience knows what Atomy does not, and that knowledge makes the act of mercy feel tragically misplaced. Dragunov's expression in this scene subtly shifts from fear to calculation. He has survived, and now his pursuit becomes personal. The chase intensifies as Dragunov unleashes motorized units and aircraft to hunt Atami down. The scale of the film expands here, shifting from isolated skirmishes to full military pursuit. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, Atami continues forward, refusing to abandon his truck and the pieces of his home. This stubborn attachment symbolizes more than nostalgia. It represents his refusal to let war take anything else from him. The house becomes a silent character in the film, a fragile reminder of everything he has lost and everything he is fighting to preserve. One of the most striking sequences in this part is the bomber attack that drives Atami and his truck off a cliff into the ocean. The moment is filmed with raw intensity, blending chaos and silence as the truck plunges into the water. For a brief moment, it seems as though the legend has finally met its end. The ocean swallows everything: man, machine, and memory. Yet, as expected, Atami survives. His emergence from the wreckage feels almost mythological, reinforcing his near-supernatural resilience without ever crossing into fantasy. Washing ashore, battered and bleeding, Atami retrieves what remains of his home. The film slows down again here, emphasizing his physical and emotional exhaustion. Instead of rushing to the next action beat, it lingers on his struggle to rebuild, even temporarily. Converting the logs into a makeshift raft, he sails back toward land, driven by nothing but sheer will. This sequence reinforces the central theme of the film. Survival is not just about staying alive, but about holding on to purpose when everything else is stripped away. His discovery of a derelict Soviet tank marks another turning point. What could have been a simple action gimmick is instead treated as a desperate gamble. Using stolen dynamite to catapult the tank over a border checkpoint is both absurd and terrifying, capturing the film's unique tone-grounded brutality, mixed with almost legendary audacity. The explosion leaves Atami severely injured, pushing his body closer to its limits than ever before. The image of him burying a knife blade into his own flesh to stabilize himself is visceral and unforgettable, a testament to his refusal to surrender to pain or fear. Eventually, Atami is captured by Dragunov, bringing part of the story to a grim pause. The hunter becomes the captor, and the balance of power shifts once again. As Atami is transported towards Siberia, the tension tightens, knowing that the inevitable truth about Dragunov's identity is yet to be revealed. This capture does not feel like defeat, but rather the calm before a far more explosive storm. The film has successfully transformed a simple revenge premise into a layered exploration of loss, resilience, and the lingering scars of war. Atami Korpi is no longer just fighting external enemies. He is battling the memories that refuse to stay buried. The stage is set for an emotional and violent reckoning, one that promises to test not only his strength, but his humanity. Atami Korpi's capture marks a crucial psychological shift in the film. For the first time since the story began, he is no longer moving forward by choice. Shackled, wounded, and barely conscious, he is dragged into a world controlled entirely by his enemies. The truck carrying the remains of his family home is seized, stripped of meaning by Soviet soldiers who see it as nothing more than stolen lumber. Yet for Atami, being separated from the house hurts almost as much as the physical injuries burning through his body. That house was his last connection to a life before violence defined him, and now it too has been taken. The train bound for Siberia becomes the film's next major setting, and it is portrayed as a moving prison, cold, metallic, and suffocating. Inside the cargo car, Atami is chained like an animal, surrounded by armed guards who alternate between fear and cruelty. They have heard the stories. They know who he is. This fear makes them brutal. They beat him not just to extract information, but to reassure themselves that he is human after all. Every blow is an attempt to break the myth, to prove that the man who refuses to die can bleed and beg like anyone else. Dragunov's presence looms heavily throughout these scenes. Even when he is not physically in the room, he watches from a distance, studying Atami with fascination rather than hatred. To Dragunov, this is not just a mission, it is a personal experiment. He wants to understand what keeps this man alive. Unlike the faceless officers barking orders, Dragunov speaks softly, deliberately, as if savoring every second of control he now possesses. His calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the chaos and violence around him, making him far more terrifying. The torture scenes are difficult to watch, not because of excessive gore, but because of how restrained they are. The film avoids sensationalism, focusing instead on endurance. Atami's silence becomes an act of defiance. He refuses to scream, refuses to plead. His breathing is labored, his vision blurs, but his will remains intact. Each moment he survives feels like a quiet victory over the men trying to erase him. The camera often lingers on his eyes, capturing flashes of memory, his wife's smile, his children's laughter, the house standing whole before it was reduced to fragments. Eventually, Dragunov decides it is time to reveal the truth. This revelation is delivered not as a dramatic outburst, but as a casual confession, making it all the more devastating. Dragunov tells Atomy about Karelia, about the village, about the night his family was slaughtered. He describes it with chilling detachment, as if recounting a routine patrol rather than a massacre. The moment Atomy realizes that the man standing before him is responsible for everything he has lost, something inside him changes permanently. This is the emotional core of Part 3. Rage finally pierces through Atomy's silence, but it is not explosive. It is cold, focused, and absolute. The myth is reborn here not as a legend told by others, but as a personal vow. Dragunov believes this confession has broken Atomy, that knowledge of the truth will crush whatever strength remains in him. Instead, it sharpens him. Pain is no longer something to endure. It becomes fuel. The train itself becomes a symbol of inevitability, rolling endlessly toward Siberia, carrying Atomy further away from freedom. But inevitability has never applied to him. Using nothing but patience and observation, he begins to plan his escape. Every guard movement, every sound of machinery, every vibration of the tracks is noted. Even in chains, Atomy remains dangerous. His body may be restrained, but his mind is already moving. The escape sequence unfolds with brutal efficiency. When Atomy finally breaks free, it is sudden and terrifying. A guard leans too close. A chain snaps. A knife is retrieved. The violence that follows is swift and merciless. There is no hesitation, no moral struggle. These men chose their side the moment they boarded the train. One by one, the guards fall, their bodies collapsing silently against steel walls, as the train continues its relentless journey. As Atomy moves through the train cars, the film transforms into a claustrophobic nightmare. Narrow corridors amplify every sound. Gunshots echo endlessly. Steam and smoke blur vision. This confined setting strips away any sense of heroism, grounding the action in desperation and survival. Atomy is injured, exhausted, and bleeding, yet unstoppable. Each kill feels heavier than the last, not because he doubts himself, but because the cost is so clear. Meanwhile, Dragunov enacts his own escape plan, murdering his KGB handlers without hesitation. This parallel escape highlights the similarities between the two men. Both are survivors shaped by war, capable of unimaginable violence. The difference lies in purpose. Dragunov kills for control and ego. Atomy kills to reclaim what was stolen. This contrast defines the moral center of the film without ever spelling it out. One of the most audacious moments in the film occurs when Atomy discovers a ballistic missile on board the train. The sheer absurdity of its presence is balanced by the film's commitment to internal logic. War has left behind weapons in the most unlikely places, and now one of them becomes a tool of survival. Activating the missile is not portrayed as a triumph, but as a desperate gamble. The roar of the engine shakes the entire train, turning it into a screaming metal beast hurtling toward destruction. The final confrontation between Atomy and Dragunov begins not with words, but with exhaustion. Both men are wounded. Both have lost everything. Their fight is raw and unpolished, devoid of cinematic grace. Punches are sloppy, movements strained. Dragunov initially gains the upper hand, taunting Atomy, believing himself superior in both strength and intellect. For a brief moment, it seems as though evil might prevail. But Atomy's endurance proves stronger than Dragunov's arrogance. Using the still-active missile, Atomy turns Dragunov's escape into his end. The launch is chaotic and horrifying, a collision of human hatred and mechanical destruction. Dragunov's death is not celebrated. It is final, quiet, and deeply personal. Atomy watches as the man who destroyed his family is erased, not with satisfaction, but with grim closure. With Dragunov dead, the train slows, damaged but still moving. Atomy, barely standing, retrieves the car carrying the remains of his home. This act is deeply symbolic. Even after all the bloodshed, his priority remains unchanged. He does not claim victory. He claims restoration. Crossing back into Finnish territory feels less like a return home, and more like emerging from a long nightmare. The final moments of Part 3 show Atomy rebuilding his house, piece by piece, in silence. Local Finnish men approach, offering help without words or questions. Their presence signifies recognition, respect, and collective healing. Atomy accepts their help with a simple nod, gratitude expressed not through speech, but through shared labor. Part 3 concludes the revenge arc, while opening the door to reflection. The violence is over, but its scars remain. Atomi Corpi stands among the ruins of his past, not as a legend, but as a man who survived when survival seemed impossible. By the time the train screeches to a halt near the Finnish border, the world around Atomi Corpi feels strangely quiet, as if history itself has paused to watch what he will do next. Smoke drifts over twisted steel, the remains of Soviet authority scattered behind him, and the cold wind carries the smell of oil, snow, and burned metal. Atomi steps down from the train car, with slow, deliberate movements, his body battered but unbroken. This journey was never about survival alone. It was about finishing something that began years ago, in blood and fire. Now, with Dragunov gone and the ghosts of the past finally silenced, Atomi turns his attention to what remains, the fragments of his old home and the idea of rebuilding a life from ruin. He unloads the salvaged logs from the train with care, treating each piece as if it were a living memory. These are not just planks of wood. They are the bones of a family, the walls that once echoed with laughter and quiet evenings before war tore everything apart. As he crosses back into Finland, there is no triumphant music or cheering crowd. Only the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the distant call of birds. The violence that defined his journey fades into the background, replaced by a heavy stillness. Atomi's face remains stoic, but his eyes carry the weight of everything he has endured. Revenge may be complete, yet peace is something he does not fully trust. The land he chooses for rebuilding is modest, surrounded by trees and open sky. It is not the exact place where his old home once stood, but it feels right. The soil is firm, the air clean, and for the first time in a long while, there is no enemy watching from the shadows. Atomi begins working immediately, driven by habit and instinct rather than hope. He sets the foundation with practiced hands, each movement efficient and purposeful. There is a quiet poetry in watching a man who has destroyed so much now focus entirely on creation. Every log placed is an act of defiance against the idea that violence is the only language he speaks. As days pass, signs of life begin to appear around him. Local Finnish men, farmers, and laborers, who have heard rumors of the legendary ex-soldier returning, approach cautiously at first. They do not ask many questions. In a land shaped by war, silence is a form of respect. One by one, they offer help. An extra pair of hands, tools, food, and shared labor. Atomi does not speak much in return, but he nods, accepting their presence. There is an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of shared suffering and survival. Together, they work without ceremony, building something that feels bigger than any single man. At night, Atomi sits alone by a small fire near the half-finished house. The flames reflect in his eyes as memories surface uninvited. He thinks of his family, not as victims, but as they were before the war. Ordinary, warm, alive. The urge for vengeance that once consumed him has burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow space that is both painful and strangely freeing. For the first time, he allows himself to imagine a future that does not revolve around killing. It is not a comforting thought, but it is an honest one. The silence of the forest wraps around him, and he breathes deeply, grounding himself in the present. The film takes its time here, lingering on the small details of rebuilding. Hammer strikes echo through the trees, sawdust drifts in the sunlight, and the structure slowly takes shape. These moments are deliberately slow, contrasting sharply with the relentless brutality that defined earlier chapters. This pacing reinforces the idea that true resolution does not come from explosive finales, but from quiet persistence. Atomi's wounds ache, both physical and emotional, yet he continues working without complaint. Pain has become a familiar companion, no longer something to fight against, but something to endure. Occasionally, Atomi glances toward the horizon, half expecting another threat to emerge. Old instincts die hard, especially for a man forged in constant conflict. But the days remain peaceful. The border, once a symbol of danger and pursuit, now feels like a distant line on a map, rather than a looming presence. Finland, scarred by war but resilient, offers him a rare gift, the chance to exist without being hunted. This sense of fragile safety is something Atomi treats with caution, aware of how easily it can be taken away. As the house nears completion, the local men gather for one final day of work. There is no formal celebration, no speeches or applause. Instead, they share a simple meal, eaten in silence and mutual respect. When it is time to leave, one of them claps Atomi on the shoulder, a brief gesture that carries more meaning than words. Atomi watches them disappear into the trees, standing alone once more. This solitude feels different now. It is no longer imposed by loss or exile, but chosen, shaped by his own will. The final scenes focus on Atomi, stepping inside the rebuilt house for the first time. The interior is sparse, almost bare, but solid. He runs his hand along the wooden wall, feeling the grain beneath his fingers. This house is not a replica of what he lost, and it was never meant to be. It is a continuation, an evolution, built from remnants of the past, but facing forward. He sets down his knife on a simple table, a symbolic act that suggests he no longer needs to keep it within reach at all times. The weapon that once defined his survival now rests quietly, no longer the center of his existence. As daylight fades, Tommy sits at the doorway, looking out over the land. The camera lingers on his face, weathered and unreadable, yet subtly transformed. He is still the man who refuses to die, but he is also something else now, a man who has chosen to live. The scars remain, and the memories will never fully disappear, but they no longer dictate every step he takes. The road to revenge has ended, not with triumphant victory, but with acceptance. The film closes on this understated note, resisting the temptation to offer easy answers or dramatic closure. There is no promise that Tommy's life will be peaceful from this point on, only the suggestion that he has reclaimed a piece of himself that was lost long before the war ended. In a world that tried to reduce him to a weapon, he has quietly, stubbornly asserted his humanity. The final image of the house standing against the vast Finnish landscape serves as a powerful metaphor, fragile yet enduring, shaped by violence but not defined by it. The rebuilt house stands firm against the wind, its wooden walls carrying both the weight of the past and the quiet promise of survival. Snow drifts lazily across the clearing, settling along the roofline and footprints that lead back toward the forest. Tommy Corpy moves through the interior with slow, deliberate steps, touching the walls as if confirming that they are real. The warmth of the fire contrasts sharply with the frozen world outside, and for the first time in years, the silence here does not feel threatening. It feels earned. Every beam, every plank has been reclaimed, not just from destruction, but from memory itself. Yet peace, even in its simplest form, never arrives without consequence. Beyond the trees, the world remains restless, shaped by borders that shift and authorities that never forget men like him. Word of Artemy's return spreads quietly, not through celebration but through rumor. Farmers speak of a lone figure rebuilding in the wilderness. Hunters whisper about tracks that appear overnight and vanish just as quickly. Former soldiers recognize the signs immediately, understanding that some men do not truly leave war behind. They simply stop being seen. Tommy senses the attention long before it reaches him. He sharpens his knife each evening, checks the perimeter each morning, and listens to the forest, the way others listen to radio broadcasts. The land tells him everything he needs to know. New footsteps, unfamiliar scents, the subtle tension in birdsong that signals intrusion. One afternoon, as clouds roll low and heavy across the sky, a small group approaches the clearing. They come openly, without weapons raised, their hands visible. These are not soldiers, but men marked by the same war that marked him. Their eyes carry exhaustion rather than hostility, respect rather than fear. They speak little, explaining only that they are veterans who heard he survived when no one else did, and that survival is something they are still trying to understand. Tommy listens without interrupting, offering neither comfort nor dismissal. When they leave, he gives them no answers, but his silence is not unkind. It simply reflects a truth they already know. Survival does not come with instructions. As weeks pass, the forest begins to change. Snow melts into mud, streams swell with icy runoff, and the air carries the scent of new growth. Tommy works alongside the land, repairing fences, clearing paths, and preparing for seasons yet to come. Each task grounds him further in the present, anchoring him to something tangible. Still, the echoes of violence remain close, never fully retreating. At night, dreams pull him back to burning convoys, collapsing tunnels, and the moment Dragunov's eyes finally lost their fire. He wakes without panic, accepting these visions as reminders rather than wounds. The outside world eventually reaches him in a more direct way. A government envoy arrives one morning, accompanied by a pair of nervous escorts. Their boots sink into the soft earth as they approach, their posture stiff with formality. They bring papers, offers of compensation, vague promises of recognition that mean nothing to a man who never asked to be remembered. They speak of rebuilding the nation, of honoring heroes, of moving forward. Tommy listens, unmoved. When they finish, he returns the documents, untouched. His refusal is calm, final, and spoken without words. The envoy leaves unsettled, realizing that some men exist beyond policy and praise. Life settles into a rhythm defined by simplicity rather than ambition. Tommy hunts when he needs food, trades quietly with nearby settlements for supplies, and keeps to himself Children from a distant village occasionally wander close, curious about the silent man and his strange house. He never chases them away, but he never invites them closer either. They sense the boundary instinctively, understanding that curiosity has limits. Over time, their visits stop, replaced by cautious nods, when paths cross by chance. One evening, as the sun dips low and casts long shadows across the clearing, Tommy notices smoke rising where it should not be. The signal is unmistakable, deliberate. He follows it without hesitation, moving through the trees with practiced ease. The source is a small camp, hastily assembled, its occupants tense and watchful. They are smugglers, operating along the border, armed and desperate. They recognize him immediately, fear flickering across their faces as his reputation catches up with them. Words are exchanged, threats implied, but never spoken aloud. Tommy does not intervene for justice or law. He intervenes because chaos breeds more chaos, and he has spilled enough blood to recognize when it is about to happen again. The confrontation is brief and decisive. When it ends, the forest reclaims the silence without ceremony. Tommy returns home before nightfall, washing his hands in the stream as if cleansing himself of something invisible. He does not dwell on the encounter, understanding that violence will always exist at the edges of peace. What matters is how often one chooses to step into it. Seasons continue their quiet rotation. The house becomes a true home, filled not with voices but with purpose. Tommy repairs tools, sharpens blades, and tends to the land as if it were a living companion. The memories of his family remain, not as pain but as presence. He speaks to them sometimes, not aloud, but through action, through the preservation of the life they once shared. The fire burns steadily each night, a constant against the darkness. In the final moments of the story, Tommy stands at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the land that has both tested and sustained him. The scars of war remain etched into the earth and into himself, but they no longer define his direction. He has carried his past across borders, through fire and steel, and laid it down piece by piece until it became something new. The world beyond the forest will continue to turn, indifferent and relentless, but here, in this quiet space, a man who refused to die has finally chosen how to live. Tommy Corpy's journey no longer revolved only around revenge. It had transformed into a brutal test of endurance, memory, and quiet resolve. With Dragonov finally dead, the chaos of the train wreck behind him, and the echoes of gunfire fading into silence, Tommy stood surrounded by twisted metal and scorched earth, feeling neither victory nor relief. What lingered instead was a heavy stillness, the kind that settles after violence has taken everything it can. His body was broken in places that refused to heal quickly, every movement reminding him of how close death had come. Yet his mind remained sharper than ever. The remains of his dismantled home were still secured with him, battered but intact, and as he looked at those weathered logs, he felt the same stubborn pull that had driven him across borders and through armies. They were more than wood and nails. They were the last physical link to a life that had been stolen from him. Every step forward now felt slower, not because his strength was gone, but because the weight of memory pressed down harder with each mile. As Tommy pushed westward toward the Finnish border, the landscape shifted from hostile territory into something almost familiar. Yet nothing truly felt the same anymore. The forests seemed quieter, the roads emptier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He moved with caution born from instinct, expecting at any moment that another enemy might emerge, another bullet might tear through the silence. But the danger this time was internal. His thoughts drifted back to his family, to moments long before war and bloodshed, when his house stood whole and laughter filled its rooms. Those memories cut deeper than any knife, because they reminded him of everything that could never be restored, no matter how carefully he rebuilt the structure itself. Still, he refused to abandon the task. Stopping would mean surrender, and surrender was something Tommy Corpy had never learned. Crossing back into Finland felt less like a triumph and more like a solemn return. The border did not welcome him with celebration or recognition. It simply allowed him to pass, indifferent to the legend that moved across it. Tommy stepped onto Finnish soil and inhaled deeply, the cold air burning his lungs in a way that felt grounding, almost cleansing. This was the land that had shaped him, hardened him, and ultimately taken everything from him. Yet it was also the only place where he could lay down the weight he had been carrying for so long. He did not expect peace, but he hoped for something quieter than war. Even silence, at this point, felt like a gift. Rebuilding the house became an act of devotion rather than construction. Each log he lifted carried a memory, and each nail driven into place felt like a small act of defiance against the forces that had tried to erase his past. The work was slow and punishing, especially with his injuries still fresh, but Atomy welcomed the pain. It kept him focused, present, anchored in the moment. Physical labor had always been his way of thinking, and now it was his way of grieving. The house did not rise quickly, nor perfectly, but it stood firm, shaped by stubborn hands and an unbreakable will. In its rough edges and uneven lines, it reflected the man who built it. As days passed, word of Atomy's return spread quietly among nearby towns. He did not seek attention, but it found him anyway. A few Finnish men approached him one afternoon, drawn by curiosity and respect rather than fear. They had heard stories, whispers of what he had done and what he had survived. Without asking questions or offering sympathy, they simply offered help. Their presence was understated, almost awkward, but deeply meaningful. Atomy accepted without words, acknowledging them with a nod. In their shared silence, there was understanding. These men did not see him as a legend or a weapon. They saw him as one of their own, a man carrying scars that mirrored their country's history. Working together, the rebuilding moved faster, though Atomy remained the quiet center of it all. He did not tell stories, did not explain himself, and no one asked him to. The past hung in the air, unspoken but recognized. As the structure slowly took shape, Atomy felt something unfamiliar stirring within him. It was not happiness, nor relief, but a faint sense of continuity. Life, brutal and unforgiving as it was, had not ended with loss. It had merely changed form. The house would never be what it once was, just as he would never be the man he had been before, but both could still stand. When the final log was set and the work came to an end, Atomy stepped back and looked at what he had created. The house stood solid against the cold Finnish landscape, weathered but unbroken. It did not erase the past, and it did not promise a peaceful future, but it marked survival. In that moment, Atomy allowed himself to rest, if only briefly. He understood that the war inside him might never fully end, that memories would continue to haunt his quiet moments. But he had reached a place where he could exist without constant violence. The road he had walked was soaked in blood and fire, yet it had led him here, back to the land that had shaped him. And as the wind moved through the trees around his rebuilt home, Atomy Korpi stood in silence, not victorious, but unbroken. After surviving the brutal chaos of the train and finally killing Igor Dragonov, Atomy Korpi's journey does not slow down, it only grows heavier. Dragging himself away from the wreckage, his body broken, but spirit unyielding, Atomy moves through the silent forests near the Finnish border, each step driven by the same quiet determination that has carried him through war, torture, and impossible odds. The train car carrying the dismantled remains of his family home rattles behind him like a ghost of the past, a reminder that this journey was never about revenge alone, but about dignity, memory, and survival. As dawn breaks, Atomy crosses back into Finnish territory, where the land feels familiar, yet altered by the scars of war. He pauses briefly, resting against a tree, blood soaking through his torn clothing, his breath shallow but steady. For a moment, memories of his family surface not as screams or flames, but as peaceful images of laughter, warmth, and belonging. These memories fuel him as he continues forward, refusing to collapse. Word of his return spreads quietly among nearby villages, whispered by hunters and farmers, who recognize the legendary ex-commando, thought to be long dead. Some see him from afar and choose not to approach, sensing the weight of violence that still clings to him. Others offer silent assistance what are left near a trail, tools abandoned by the roadside, acts of respect rather than curiosity. As Atomy reaches a clearing near a remote lakeside, he begins the slow process of rebuilding. Using the recovered logs from his destroyed house, he constructs a temporary shelter. Each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. Pain surges through his wounds with every strike of the hammer, yet he never stops, treating the labor as both survival and penance. The rebuilding becomes a way to anchor himself back into the world after so much bloodshed. Meanwhile, remnants of Soviet forces remain restless across the border, their failure to kill Atomy igniting fear rather than resolve. Intelligence reports speak of a man who survived missile blasts, train wrecks, and execution attempts, turning him into something more myth than soldier. Though official orders demand restraint to avoid political fallout, rogue elements quietly discuss eliminating him before his legend inspires others. Back in Finland, local authorities become aware of Atomy's presence, but deliberately look the other way, understanding that confronting him would serve no purpose. As days pass, Atomy's condition worsens, fever sets in, and infection creeps through his wounds. Yet, even weakened, he refuses to surrender. He crafts crude medical tools, cleans his injuries with boiling water, and stitches his own flesh with hands that barely tremble. The silence of the wilderness surrounds him, broken only by the wind and the distant call of birds, creating a stark contrast to the explosions and screams that haunted his recent past. One evening, as rain begins to fall, Tommy notices figures approaching from the tree-lined 3 Finnish men, veterans by their posture and eyes. They stop several meters away, raising their hands to show they mean no harm. Without words, they offer supplies, clean bandages, food, and stronger tools. Tommy studies them carefully, then gives a single nod. They do not ask questions or tell stories. They simply help him stabilize the structure of the house, reinforcing walls and securing the roof. Their presence is brief but meaningful, reminding Atomi that while he fights alone, he is not forgotten. After they leave, Atomi sits by the fire, staring into the flames as exhaustion finally overwhelms him. Sleep comes heavy and dreamless, the first true rest he has known in years. When he awakens, the fever has broken, and the pain feels distant, manageable. Over the following weeks, the house slowly takes shape, transforming from scattered wreckage into a symbol of endurance. Atomi moves with renewed purpose, his actions quieter now, no longer driven by violence, but by preservation. He carves small details into the wood, personal touches meant only for himself and the memory of his family. News eventually reaches him that Soviet agents have ceased their pursuit, choosing instead to let the legend fade rather than provoke further disaster. Atomi does not react. Such concerns belong to another world. As the house nears completion, Atomi stands back and surveys his work, the structure standing firm against the elements. For the first time since the war, his face softens, not into a smile, but into something close to peace. He steps inside, closing the door behind him, leaving the violence of the past outside where it belongs. The legend of the man who refuses to die lingers in whispers and rumors. But Atomi Korpi chooses silence, choosing instead to live among the ruins and memories he fought so fiercely to protect. The quiet that settles around Atomi Korpi after the rebuilding of his house is not peaceful in the traditional sense. It's heavy, layered with memories that refuse to fade. Each morning, he wakes before sunrise, sitting outside on the rough wooden steps, staring across the mist-covered land. The world around him feels suspended, as if time itself is hesitant to move forward in the presence of a man who has survived too much. Though the house now stands strong, sheltering him from the elements, Atomi understands that physical safety does not erase the weight carried within. The scars on his body itch and ache, reminders of the torture, the train, the missile, and the relentless pursuit that nearly ended him. Yet he refuses to see himself as broken. Instead, he begins establishing a routine, grounding himself in simple tasks: chopping wood, fishing by the lake, repairing tools left rusted by neglect. These actions are not merely about survival. They are about reclaiming control over a life that war tried to steal. News from nearby settlements slowly reaches him through passing hunters and traders, carried casually as if discussing weather. Stories of post-war tensions, shifting borders, and men disappearing in the night paint a bleak picture of a world still struggling to heal. Atomi listens without comment, offering only a nod, as if he already knows that peace is fragile and temporary. One afternoon, while gathering supplies from an abandoned outpost, Atomi senses movements subtle, deliberate. His instincts, sharpened by years of combat, awaken instantly. He does not reach for a weapon, but instead remains still, observing. A lone man steps into view, unarmed and visibly nervous, introducing himself as a former Finnish soldier who had heard rumors of Atomi's return. The man speaks quickly, explaining that Soviet loyalists and mercenaries still circulate near the border, searching for unfinished business. Atomi thanks him quietly, offering food and water before sending him away. The warning lingers long after the man leaves, confirming what Atomi already suspected. Legends do not die easily. That night, Atomi reinforces the house's defenses, setting subtle traps around the perimeter. Nothing lethal, just enough to alert him if danger approaches. His movements are precise, methodical, driven by experience rather than fear. As days turn into weeks, his strength gradually returns, though the pain never fully disappears. He accepts it as part of his existence, no different from breathing. One evening, a distant explosion echoes across the land, followed by faint gunfire. Atomi stands outside, listening carefully, gauging distance and direction. He knows better than to intervene without purpose, yet he also understands that violence has a way of finding him. At dawn, smoke rises on the horizon, and later that day, 2 wounded men stumble into his clearing, Finnish civilians caught between clashing groups. Without hesitation, Atomy helps them, cleaning wounds and providing shelter. They recognize him instantly, eyes widening with disbelief, but they say nothing, sensing his preference for silence. Their presence disrupts his isolation, forcing him to confront a reality beyond personal survival. Through fragmented conversations, Atomy learns that rogue Soviet elements are attempting to smuggle weapons across the border, destabilizing the region. Local resistance groups are forming, poorly armed and desperate. The wounded men speak of fear, of families hiding in forests, of villages living under constant threat. Atomy listens, his face unreadable, but something shifts within him. That night, sleep evades him. He stares at the ceiling, memories of winter war battles resurfacing, moments when he fought not for revenge, but for people who had no other defense. By morning, his decision is clear. He does not seek glory or recognition, but he will not allow others to suffer simply because he chooses silence. After ensuring the wounded men can travel safely, Atomy prepares himself, gathering weapons hidden away since his return. He moves cautiously toward the border region, tracking movements with the same precision that once made him a feared commando. The landscape becomes harsher, marked by burned vehicles and abandoned camps. He observes Soviet mercenaries from afar, noting their numbers, routes, and weaknesses. When he strikes, it is swift and decisive. Supply lines sabotaged, vehicles disabled, communications destroyed. He avoids unnecessary bloodshed, but shows no mercy when confronted directly. Word spreads quickly among both sides that Atomy Corpi is active again, not as a force of vengeance but as a silent guardian. The mercenaries grow paranoid, suspecting betrayal among themselves, while local resistance fighters find renewed courage, emboldened by unseen assistance. Atomy never reveals himself, operating like a shadow that moves with purpose and disappears without trace. During one particularly brutal encounter, he corners a Soviet officer who recognizes him immediately, fear flooding his eyes. The man begs, offering information in exchange for mercy. Atomy listens, extracting details about planned operations and safe routes, then knocks him unconscious, leaving him bound for authorities to find. It is a deliberate choice, a rejection of the endless cycle of killing. As the weeks pass, the threat diminishes, smuggling routes collapse, mercenary groups scatter, and the border region slowly stabilizes. Atomy returns home, exhausted but resolute, his role fulfilled. He cleans his weapons and buries them beneath the floor of the house, sealing them away as if closing a chapter of his life. Standing outside at sunset, he watches the light fade across the land, feeling something unfamiliar settle within him, not happiness, but acceptance. He understands that violence may always follow him, but it does not have to define him. The legend will persist, whispered in fear and awe. Yet Atomy Corpi chooses a different ending, one of quiet endurance rather than endless war. Morning arrives with a thin veil of frost clinging to the ground, and Atomy Corpi stands at the edge of his clearing, listening to the land breathe. The recent weeks of quiet operations near the border have left him physically drained, yet mentally sharper than ever. He senses that the calm settling over the region is not permanent, merely a pause between deeper tensions. As he begins repairing a section of fence damaged by winter winds, distant engines hum faintly through the forest, too controlled and steady to belong to civilians. Atomy freezes, letting the sound pass through him like a warning. By the time the noise fades, he already knows that organized forces are still probing the region, testing for weaknesses. Later that day, he ventures toward a nearby village to trade supplies, keeping his presence discreet. The village feels uneasy, windows shuttered, conversations hushed, eyes constantly scanning the roads. An elderly man quietly warns Atomy that a coalition of Soviet-backed enforcers has begun recruiting locals through intimidation, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. The strategy is familiar, and it disgusts him. That evening, smoke curls into the sky from the outskirts of the village, signaling a forced demonstration of power. Atomy does not rush in blindly. Instead, he studies the situation from a hilltop, watching armed men confiscate food and fuel while villagers stand helplessly by. He waits until nightfall, when darkness grants him invisibility. Moving silently, he disables the vehicles first, puncturing fuel lines and sabotaging engines with practiced efficiency. Panic spreads among the enforcers as radios fail and trucks refuse to start. Atomy reveals himself only when necessary, appearing suddenly behind isolated guards, disarming them with minimal force. The villagers watch in disbelief as their oppressors are bound and abandoned without bloodshed. Atomy leaves before gratitude can turn into attention, melting back into the forest like a ghost. Over the following days, similar incidents ripple across nearby settlements. Coercive forces neutralized, Supplies restored, fear slowly loosening its grip. Resistance groups, once scattered and disorganized, begin coordinating through subtle signals and word of mouth, guided by an unseen hand. Atomy never claims leadership, but his actions shape their confidence, teaching them that strength does not always announce itself. Meanwhile, remnants of Dragunov's former network grow desperate, realizing that brute force alone will not break a man who has already faced death repeatedly. They begin setting traps, spreading misinformation, and using civilians as bait. Atomy recognizes the shift immediately. During a reconnaissance mission near a frozen river, he narrowly avoids an ambush, spotting unnatural tracks that betray hidden positions. He retreats, choosing patience over confrontation, knowing that survival depends on restraint as much as aggression. That night, memories resurface, uninvited: his family's laughter, the warmth of the house before it was torn apart by war. The weight of those memories presses harder than any physical wound, reminding him why he fights without hatred. The next morning, he intercepts a messenger, carrying coded instructions meant for mercenary units, regrouping deeper in the forest. Deciphering the message reveals a planned offensive targeting multiple villages simultaneously, designed to overwhelm resistance and restore control. Atomy understands that stopping it requires more than isolated strikes. He spends days observing, mapping routes, noting supply caches, and identifying leaders who coordinate the operation. When he finally moves, it is with precision that borders on inevitability. One by one, command posts fall silent, supply depots are destroyed, and leaders vanish into the wilderness, captured or forced to flee. Confusion cripples the offensive before it can begin, leaving mercenary units scattered and leaderless. The aftermath is quiet but heavy, as if the land itself exhales after holding its breath too long. Villagers cautiously resume daily routines, children venturing outside for the first time in weeks, laughter returning in hesitant bursts. Atomy watches from afar, refusing to step into the center of relief he helped create. He knows that heroes invite dependency, and dependency breeds weakness. As winter deepens, snowfall erases tracks and memories alike, covering evidence of conflict beneath a blanket of white. Atomy returns to his home, where the silence now feels earned rather than imposed. He spends evenings reading worn books salvaged from abandoned buildings, reconnecting with thoughts beyond survival and violence. Occasionally, travelers pass through, sharing news of stabilized borders and declining unrest, attributing it to shifting politics rather than any single figure. Atomy prefers it that way. One night, under a sky thick with stars, he hears distant wolves howling, a reminder that nature remains indifferent to human struggles. He sits by the fire, sharpening a knife not out of necessity but habit, reflecting on the strange balance he has found. The legend of the man who refuses to die continues to circulate, yet Atomy himself feels less defined by it. He understands now that endurance is not only about surviving conflict, but also knowing when to let go. As dawn breaks, he steps outside, breathing deeply, grounded in the present moment. The road ahead is uncertain, but for the first time since the war, uncertainty does not feel like a threat, it feels like possibility. The thaw begins slowly, almost imperceptibly, as thin streams of meltwater carve paths through the snow. And Atomy senses that, with the changing season, comes a different kind of danger. Winter had concealed movements and erased tracks, but spring reveals everything, including intentions. He notices increased activity along the distant road trucks, moving at irregular hours, scouts testing forest edges, and unfamiliar signals exchanged between hills. These are not remnants acting in panic. This is something coordinated, disciplined, and patient. Atomy understands that whoever remains behind the curtain has learned from past failures. He begins preparing without urgency, reinforcing hidden shelters, relocating supplies, and memorizing alternate routes that twist through bogs and rocky outcrops. When he ventures toward a river crossing used by traders, he finds it newly guarded, not aggressively, but with calculated restraint. The soldiers stationed there are younger, less brutal, more observant. This unsettles him more than cruelty ever could. He spends days watching them, noting their rotations, listening to fragments of conversation carried by the wind. They speak of containment rather than conquest, of borders stabilized through quiet dominance rather than fear. It becomes clear that the enemy now seeks to neutralize influence instead of confronting it directly. Rumors spread through villages that cooperation will bring food security and protection, and many people, exhausted by years of conflict, consider compliance a reasonable compromise. Atomy does not blame them. He has seen what endless resistance costs. One evening, a small delegation approaches his territory, not soldiers, but intermediaries claiming to represent a provisional authority. They do not threaten him. Instead, they offer terms, safe passage, resources, and silence in exchange for his withdrawal from contested zones. The proposal is delivered calmly, almost respectfully, as if negotiating with a force of nature rather than a man. Atami listens without interruption, his expression unreadable. He knows that accepting would preserve lives in the short term, but surrender something far greater. The idea that survival must never come at the cost of dignity. He gives no immediate answer, allowing the delegation to leave with uncertainty, gnawing at them. That night, he weighs the consequences carefully, staring into the fire as shadows dance across the walls of his rebuilt home. Memories surface again, not violently this time, but gently, his family seated together, unafraid, believing in a future that was stolen too soon. By morning, his decision is clear. He does not seek war, but he will not accept a peace built on submission. Rather than attacking openly, he chooses a subtler response. Over the following weeks, supply routes feeding the Provisional Authority begin failing mysteriously. Bridges collapse due to natural causes, communication lines degrade, and cooperative leaders find their promises impossible to fulfill. The system begins to fracture under its own weight, unable to maintain control without exposing itself. Meanwhile, Atami quietly assists villages in establishing self-sufficiency, teaching methods of storage, defense, and mutual warning that require no centralized command. The people grow less dependent, less fearful, and less persuadable. The authorities notice too late, when they attempt a decisive show of strength, mobilizing a column of vehicles toward a critical settlement. Atami intervenes, not with violence, but with precision sabotage that immobilizes the convoy deep in marshland. No shots are fired. The message is unmistakable. Escalation will be costly and futile, faced with mounting logistical failure and diminishing local cooperation. The Provisional Authority begins withdrawing assets, redirecting attention elsewhere. The land grows quieter again, though this silence feels different, turned through resilience rather than force. Atami observes from afar as life resumes a fragile normalcy. Fields are planted, trade cautiously revives, and children relearn how to play without glancing over their shoulders. He avoids becoming a symbol, disappearing whenever his presence risks overshadowing the community's own strength. In solitude, he reflects on the evolution of his journey. Revenge had once driven him forward, like an unyielding storm, but now purpose feels broader, less anchored to pain. He understands that survival is not only resistance, but adaptation, knowing when to fight, when to endure, and when to step aside. As summer approaches, Atami packs lightly and ventures deeper into the wilderness, not to escape, but to explore what remains of a world slowly stitching itself back together. The legend will continue without him, exaggerated and distorted, but the man himself moves on, guided not by anger or obligation, but by a quiet commitment to protect life without ruling it. Beneath open skies, with no road demanding his return, Atami Korpi walks forward, content with uncertainty, trusting that the land and the people within it will endure. Atami's journey now moves into a phase where survival is no longer just about brute force, but about endurance, memory, and the quiet weight of everything he has lost. After crossing back into finished territory, with the remnants of his dismantled home secured once again, his body bears the cost of every fight he has endured. The wounds he carries are not just physical. They are reminders of a past that refuses to loosen its grip. Each step forward feels heavier, as if the land itself remembers the blood spilled across it during the war. The forests are calmer here, but that calm is deceptive, filled with echoes of gunfire and screams that once tore through these same trees. Atami moves slowly, deliberately, rebuilding his strength as he goes, relying on instinct rather than hope. Nights are the hardest. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by flashes of his family's faces. Moments of warmth that contrast sharply with the cold brutality he has lived through. He does not cry, not because the pain is absent, but because grief has hardened into something quieter and more permanent. Along the road, he encounters traces of a world trying to rebuild itself after devastation. Abandoned vehicles rusting by the roadside, half-burned villages where people once laughed and lived, and scattered signs of life slowly returning. These moments do not inspire optimism in him, but they reinforce his resolve. He understands rebuilding is not about restoring what once was, but about carrying forward what still matters. As he reaches a small settlement, wary locals watch him from a distance. His reputation precedes him, whispered through stories of a man who refuses to die. They offer no questions, only cautious glances and minimal aid. Atami accepts what is given without expectation, trading labor for supplies, fixing broken tools, reinforcing damaged structures, his hands skilled and efficient. Through this, he regains a sense of purpose that goes beyond revenge. Each repaired beam and sharpened blade is a reminder that his hands were once used to create, not only destroy. Yet danger has not entirely vanished. News spreads of remnants of Soviet patrols, still roaming near the borders, men unwilling to accept the war's end. Atami listens silently, knowing too well how unfinished wars breed monsters on both sides. When he leaves the settlement, he does so before dawn, choosing solitude over attachment. The road ahead leads him deeper into the wilderness, toward a place where he intends to rebuild his home, far from borders and politics. Along the way, nature tests him again. Sudden storms, freezing rain, and terrain that punishes every misstep. His injuries reopen, forcing him to improvise crude bandages and splints. Pain becomes background noise, something acknowledged but never indulged. As days pass, his strength slowly returns, fueled by stubborn will rather than nourishment. He hunts sparingly, taking only what he needs, honoring the land that shelters him. In moments of stillness, he speaks to his family aloud, not as ghosts, but as companions walking beside him. These conversations ground him, reminding him why he continues, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him. When he finally reaches a secluded clearing, surrounded by dense forest and a nearby stream, he stops. There is no dramatic revelation, no sign declaring this place as safe. It is simply quiet, untouched, and distant from everything that tried to kill him. He unloads the pieces of his home with care, laying them out as if assembling a puzzle of memories. The work is slow, exhausting, and deeply personal. Each log carries a story, a fragment of the life he once shared. As he works, he feels something unfamiliar stirring beneath the exhaustion. Not peace, but the possibility of it. This place will never erase what happened, but it can hold what remains. By nightfall, as he lights a small fire and sits beside it, the silence no longer feels empty, it feels earned. For the first time since the war, Atami allows himself to rest without expecting an attack at every sound. The road to revenge may be complete, but the road to living has only just begun. Morning arrives quietly in the forest, filtered through tall pines, and carried on cold air that settles deep into Atami's bones. The fire he built the night before has burned down to glowing embers, and for a brief moment he allows himself to sit still, listening to the slow rhythm of nature around him. There is no urgency in the sounds here, no distant engines or shouted commands, only wind, birds, and the steady flow of water nearby. Yet even in this calm, his mind remains alert. War has trained him to expect danger in silence, and peace feels almost unfamiliar. Like a language he once knew, but has forgotten how to speak. He rises and begins working again without ceremony. Lifting logs, aligning beams, testing their weight and strength with practiced hands. Each movement is deliberate, shaped by years of survival, but also softened by intention. This is not a bunker or a temporary shelter meant to withstand an attack. It is a home, meant to endure seasons rather than battles. As he rebuilds, memories surface uninvited. He recalls his wife standing in the doorway of the old house, sunlight catching in her hair, and his children running through the yard with careless laughter. These images no longer stab him with the same sharp pain as before. Instead, they settle into him like warmth. Fragile, but real, he works through the day, pausing only to drink from the stream and tend to his wounds. The injuries he sustains still ache, especially when he lifts heavier pieces of wood, but he treats pain as another tool to be managed rather than feared. By afternoon, the skeleton of the house begins to take shape. It is imperfect, scarred by time and violence, yet solid. As he steps back to look at it, he feels a quiet sense of accomplishment that no victory in battle ever gave him. This is creation, not destruction, and it demands a different kind of strength. His solitude is broken when he notices movement at the edge of the clearing. Several men stand among the trees, hesitant, keeping their distance. They are finished civilians, worn by the war, carrying tools rather than weapons. Atami does not reach for his knife or rifle. He waits, watching their posture, their expressions. Eventually, one of them steps forward and speaks carefully, offering help. Word has spread of who he is and what he has done, but there is no fear in their voices. Only respect and something close to gratitude. Atami considers them for a long moment. Trust does not come easily, but he recognizes the same exhaustion in their faces that he sees in his own reflection. He nods once, silently granting permission. They work together without unnecessary conversation, passing beams, reinforcing joints, lifting what one man alone could not manage. There is an unspoken understanding among them, forged by shared loss rather than shared ideology. As the structure grows stronger, the clearing feels less empty, filled instead with the sound of effort and cooperation. When evening comes, they share a simple meal by the fire. No one asks him about the war or his acts of violence. They speak instead of crops, weather, and families waiting elsewhere. This normality feels strange but grounding. For the first time, Atomi allows others to carry part of the weight he has borne alone for so long. After the men leave at dawn the next day, promising to return if needed, the forest returns to silence. But it is no longer oppressive. Days pass as he continues refining the house, sealing gaps, reinforcing walls, and building a modest hearth. Each improvement is small, but together they transform the structure into something livable. He begins to plan beyond survival, thinking about storing food, preparing for winter, and cultivating the land around him. These thoughts mark a shift within him. Revenge no longer drives his actions. Responsibility does. Responsibility to memory, to the dead, and to whatever future he may still claim. At night, he sits by the fire and sharpens his knife, not out of paranoia, but habit. The blade reflects the flames, and he studies his own reflection in it, a face lined by age and experience. He no longer recognizes the man he was before the war, but he accepts the man he has become. One evening, distant thunder rolls across the sky, and rain begins to fall, heavy and relentless. He watches as water runs off the roof he built with his own hands, the structure holding firm. The storm feels symbolic, washing over the land without destroying it. A reminder that not every force is meant to break you. As the rain subsides, the air feels cleaner, the forest renewed. Atomi steps outside and breathes deeply, grounding himself in the present moment. He understands now that survival is not just about enduring hardship, but about choosing what comes after it. His journey has taken him through hatred, loss, and unimaginable violence. But it has led him here, to a place where he can finally stand still. The road behind him is soaked in blood and fire, but the path ahead, though uncertain, is quieter. He does not expect forgiveness from the world, nor does he seek redemption. What he seeks is balance, a way to exist without constantly being at war with his surroundings. As he closes the door of his rebuilt home for the first time, the sound resonates softly through the clearing. It is not the sound of an ending, but of a beginning shaped by scars rather than erased by them. In the fading light, Atomi sits inside, the fire casting gentle shadows on the walls, and allows himself to imagine a life defined not by how many enemies he has killed, but by how long he can keep this fragile peace intact. The first full night inside the rebuilt house feels heavier than any battlefield Atomi has ever slept through. The walls are sturdy, the roof secure, yet his body remains alert, responding to every creak of wood and whisper of wind as if they were warning signals. He lies awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the fire settle into embers. Peace, he realizes, demands a different discipline than war. There is no clear enemy to watch for, no orders to follow, no immediate danger to react against. Instead, there is memory, and memory is far less predictable. Eventually, exhaustion pulls him into shallow sleep, filled with dreams that blur past and present together. He sees Karelia as it once was, fields untouched by shelling, laughter echoing across open land. Then the vision fractures into smoke and gunfire. He wakes before dawn, breath heavy, hands clenched as if still holding a weapon. For a moment, instinct tells him to prepare for combat, but the silence outside remains unchanged. He stands, stretches his stiff limbs, and steps outside into the pale morning light. Frost coats the ground, sparkling faintly as the sun rises. The land feels indifferent to his suffering, and oddly, that comforts him. Nature does not judge or remember, it simply continues. He begins his day by reinforcing the outer edges of the house, adding small improvements meant to keep the cold at bay. Each nail he drives into the wood feels like a declaration of intent. He plans to stay. As the hours pass, he notices how his movements have slowed, not from weakness, but from caution born of purpose. He no longer rushes, no longer works with the frantic energy of a man fleeing death. He works like someone building something meant to last. Around midday, he takes his rifle and ventures into the forest, not to hunt enemies, but food. The act feels strange, almost ceremonial. Tracking animals requires patience, rather than aggression, observation rather than dominance. When he finally brings down a deer, he does so cleanly, efficiently, and with a quiet respect. He carries it back himself, shoulders burning, and prepares the meat with care. This is survival stripped of ideology and violence, reduced to necessity. As he works, He reflects on the path that led him here. Every step of his journey was fueled by loss and rage. Yet none of that could have sustained him indefinitely. Revenge burned bright, but brief. What remains now is endurance. In the afternoon, clouds gather, casting long shadows over the clearing. He uses the time to sort through the few possessions he has left. His knife, worn smooth by years of use. His rifle, maintained meticulously. A handful of personal items salvaged from the wreckage of his former life. He pauses longest over a small, damaged photograph. Its edges curled and faded. The faces are barely visible, but he knows them by heart. He does not speak their names aloud. Some things are kept alive through silence rather than words. As evening approaches, the forest grows quiet again, and with it comes a familiar sense of isolation. This time, however, it does not feel like abandonment. It feels chosen. He lights the fire and cooks, the smell of meat filling the small space, grounding him in the present. As he eats, he considers the men who helped him rebuild. Their offer was simple, unburdened by politics or fear. It reminds him that the world, though brutal, is not entirely devoid of solidarity. He wonders whether he will ever fully reintegrate into society, or if this solitude is permanent. The thought does not frighten him. After what he has seen and done, distance feels like honesty. Night falls, and with it, a storm rolls in, heavier than the last. Rain lashes against the walls, testing the structure. Tommy listens closely, alert for weaknesses, but the house holds. Thunder cracks overhead, shaking the ground, and lightning briefly illuminates the interior through the small window. In those flashes, he sees not a fortress, but a refuge. The storm rages for hours, yet he remains seated, calm, allowing it to pass. When silence finally returns, it feels earned. In the days that follow, a routine begins to form. He hunts, repairs, prepares, rests. There are moments when memories surge unexpectedly, triggered by a sound or smell, but he does not fight them. He lets them come and go, understanding now that pain resisted only grows stronger. Instead, he acknowledges it, then returns to the task at hand. One afternoon, as he works near the edge of the clearing, he notices tracks that are not his own. They are human, recent, but not hostile. He follows them cautiously until he finds signs of a small camp, abandoned but orderly. Someone passed through, rested, then moved on. The realization stirs something complex within him. The world is still moving, still populated by people trying to rebuild their own lives after devastation. He is not as alone as he sometimes believes. That evening, he reinforces the perimeter, not out of fear, but habit. Preparedness remains part of who he is. As weeks pass, the land around the house begins to change subtly. Paths form where he walks most often, wood piles grow, supplies become organized. The chaos of survival gives way to structure. This transformation mirrors something inside him. He no longer wakes with his heart racing, no longer reaches for his weapon at every imagined threat. The man known as the one who refuses to die begins, slowly, to learn how to live. He understands that this peace is fragile, contingent on forces beyond his control. But fragility does not make it meaningless. If anything, it makes it precious. One quiet evening, he sits outside watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Colors stretching across the sky in ways that remind him of fire without the destruction. He thinks of the future, not in grand terms, but in simple possibilities. Another winter survived, another structure improved, another day lived without bloodshed. These are modest ambitions, but they feel honest. When darkness settles, he returns inside and closes the door. The sound is firm, reassuring. For a man who has spent so much of his life refusing death, this moment represents something far more difficult, accepting life, with all its uncertainty and restraint. He does not know how long this peace will last, nor does he try to predict it. He only knows that for now, he has chosen stillness over fury, creation over destruction. And in that choice, he finds a strength deeper than any he wielded in war. The first snowfall arrives quietly, almost politely, as if the land itself is testing whether Tommy is ready to accept another season. He notices it at dawn, thin white flakes settling over the clearing and softening the sharp edges of the world he has grown used to. Snow has always carried complicated meaning for him. It once served as cover, as camouflage, as a battlefield ally that hid blood and bodies alike. Now, it simply blankets the ground, demanding preparation rather than violence. He steps outside, boots crunching lightly, and studies the sky. Winter will be long, and he knows better than anyone that nature does not forgive neglect. The day becomes one of quiet urgency. He secures firewood, stacking it higher, tighter, ensuring it will stay dry even through heavy storms. Inside the house, he reinforces insulation using whatever materials he has managed to gather, sealing gaps where wind might creep in during the coldest nights. His movements are methodical, practiced, yet gentler than they once were. There is no enemy pressure forcing speed, only the steady awareness that survival now depends on foresight instead of reflex. As the snow thickens, memories surface uninvited. He recalls marches through frozen terrain, men collapsing from exhaustion, weapons freezing in gloved hands. Those memories feel distant, belonging to another lifetime, yet they still cling stubbornly to his thoughts. He does not push them away. Instead, he lets them exist alongside the present, acknowledging that they shaped him without allowing them to define his future. By midday, the snowfall intensifies, and visibility shrinks. He decides to check his traps, moving carefully through the forest paths he has memorized. Each step is deliberate, conserving energy. When he retrieves a hare from one of the snares, he pauses for a moment, offering a silent nod before continuing. Survival, he has learned, carries responsibility. It is not conquest, but balance. Back at the house, he prepares the meat, smoke rising into the cold air, carrying a scent that feels grounding, almost domestic. As evening approaches, the storm worsens, wind howling through the trees, with enough force to bend their crowns. He retreats indoors, lighting the fire, and settling into the rhythm of waiting. Storms are endured, not fought. Hours pass with little to do but think. He considers the men who helped him rebuild, wondering where they have gone, and whether they found peace of their own. He considers the wider world, fractured by war and shifting borders, and realizes that distance has granted him clarity. Power struggles, revenge, and ideology all shrink when stripped of constant reinforcement. What remains is the simple fact of existence. When the storm finally eases late at night, he opens the door briefly, letting cold air rush in, confirming that the structure holds firm. The house has passed its first true test. The following days fall into a steady pattern shaped by winter's demands. Hunting becomes harder, resources scarcer, but Atami adapts without complaint. Scarcity has never frightened him. Waste has. He rationed his supplies carefully, calculating consumption with the same precision he once applied to combat scenarios. Each decision is weighed, every action purposeful. Occasionally, he hears distant sounds that suggest movement beyond his immediate territory. He does not investigate impulsively. Experience has taught him that not every unknown requires confrontation. Sometimes awareness alone is enough. One afternoon, while repairing a damaged section of roof, he notices smoke on the horizon, faint but unmistakable. Someone else is out there, surviving as he is. The knowledge stirs neither fear nor curiosity strong enough to act on. Instead, it reinforces his understanding that the world continues beyond his solitude, regardless of his participation. As the weeks pass, his body adjusts to the slower pace of life. Old injuries ache more persistently in the cold, reminding him that time is relentless, even toward those who refuse to die. He addresses the pain pragmatically, adjusting his workload, allowing rest where once he would have ignored it. This, too, is survival. One evening, while sharpening his knife by firelight, he reflects on the irony of his reputation. To others, he is a legend, a symbol of relentless endurance. To himself, he is simply a man who learned too late that survival is more than resisting death. It is choosing what to live for, after death has lost its grip. The fire crackles, casting shifting shadows across the walls. And for the first time in a long while, he allows himself a moment of stillness without tension. He does not scan the room for threats, does not rehearse contingencies. He just exists. Outside, the forest remains quiet, snow dampening sound, turning the world inward. In that silence, he senses a fragile peace taking root, one that does not depend on victory or defeat. It depends only on continuity. As winter deepens, he prepares mentally for isolation, knowing that months may pass without human contact. Surprisingly, the thought does not trouble him. Loneliness, he has learned, is not the absence of people, but the absence of purpose. Here, his purpose is clear. Protect the home, maintain life. Honor the past without being consumed by it. Late one night, as he watches embers fade into ash, he feels something unfamiliar settle over him. It is not happiness, nor relief, but acceptance. He accepts that his life will never resemble what it once was, and that this divergence is not a failure. It is adaptation. When he finally lies down to sleep, the wind outside gentle rather than threatening. He does so without armor or weapon within immediate reach. It is a small act, almost insignificant, yet it marks a profound shift. Trust. Even limited trust in the quiet of the night is something he has not allowed himself in years. As sleep comes, it is deeper than before, unbroken by sudden images or reflexive fear. The storm of his past has not vanished, but it no longer controls the present. In this remote corner of Finland, surrounded by snow and silence, Tommy Korpi continues forward, not as a soldier or a legend, but as a man choosing, day by day, to remain. Spring arrives not with celebration, but with subtle resistance. The snow does not vanish overnight. It retreats reluctantly, patch by patch, revealing earth darkened by months of cold pressure. Tommy watches this slow transformation with the patience of someone who understands that recovery is never instant. The land breathes again, and so does he. With thawed ground comes new responsibility. Winter survival demanded preservation. Spring demands rebuilding. He inspects the house carefully, noting where ice weight strained beams, where moisture seeped into joints. Repairs begin immediately. Each fix feels symbolic, reinforcing that permanence is not achieved once, but maintained repeatedly. As days lengthen, he extends his work beyond the immediate. He clears fallen branches, reopens overgrown paths, reclaims territory that winter temporarily stole. The forest responds quietly, birds returning, animals leaving fresh tracks that signal renewal rather than threat. These signs ground him in the present, anchoring his awareness firmly away from memories of war zones and destruction. Yet, despite the calm, his vigilance does not disappear. It evolves. One morning, while checking traps near the riverbank, he notices boot prints alongside animal tracks. They are fresh, deliberate, human. He studies them closely, estimating weight, direction, pace. Whoever passed through did not linger, did not scout aggressively. A traveler, perhaps, or someone avoiding notice altogether. Tommy does not follow. He marks the observation mentally and adjusts his routines slightly, choosing caution without paranoia. The balance feels natural now. Weeks pass, and no further signs appear. The river swells with meltwater, carrying debris downstream, its sound louder than it has been in months. He spends time fishing, standing motionless for long stretches, letting patience replace urgency. During one such moment, he reflects on how different this stillness feels from the tense waiting of ambushes and patrols. Here, nothing depends on sudden reaction. Success depends on alignment with the environment. When he catches fish, he takes only what he needs, releasing smaller ones without hesitation. Survival has taught him restraint more effectively than ideology ever could. As spring progresses, his isolation is interrupted again, this time unmistakably. Two men appear at the edge of the clearing one afternoon, hands visible, posture cautious. They are not soldiers. Their clothing is worn, civilian, practical. Tommy remains where he is, axe resting against a stump, body relaxed but ready. No words are exchanged immediately. Silence stretches, testing intentions. Finally, one of the men speaks, introducing himself simply, explaining they are traveling west in search of work. They had heard rumors of a man living alone beyond the forest, someone who survived when others did not. Tommy listens without expression. Rumors are persistent things, he knows. He neither confirms nor denies anything. The men do not push, they ask only for water and directions. He provides both. Before leaving, one of them offers to trade supplies, laying out items they carry. Dried food, basic tools. Tommy considers briefly, then accepts a small exchange, fair and efficient. No stories are shared. No pasts discussed. When they depart, the clearing returns to quiet. Yet something has shifted. The encounter reinforces that the world beyond his solitude continues to move, change, rebuild in its own uneven way. That night, he reflects on how Isli violence once followed such meetings. Suspicion was default. Now, restraint governs his choices. Not because he is weaker, but because he no longer needs to prove strength through dominance. Spring deepens into early summer, and the landscape grows lush. Tommy begins planting a small garden near the house, choosing hardy crops suited to the climate. The act feels almost radical. Growing food rather than hunting it represents commitment to the future, an acknowledgement that he intends to remain. Each seed pressed into soil carries quiet intent. He waters them regularly, checks growth daily, adjusting placement as sunlight shifts. Watching something grow under his care is unfamiliar, yet strangely grounding. One evening, while resting near the fire, he allows himself to think about legacy. Not in terms of stories told about him, but in tangible impact. If someone were to find this place years from now, what would remain? A functional house. A cultivated plot of land. Signs that someone lived deliberately rather than destructively. The thought satisfies him more than any recognition ever could. His body continues to change with the seasons. Strength remains, but flexibility matters more now. He adapts his routines accordingly, incorporating rest without guilt. Old scars fade further into the background, no longer constant reminders. They exist, but they no longer dictate behavior. Late one afternoon, thunder rolls across the sky, distant at first, then closer. Storms in warmer seasons feel different, more volatile. He secures loose equipment, checks drainage around the house, and prepares to wait it out. When the rain finally breaks, it is heavy and relentless, soaking the ground, filling the air with the scent of earth and growth. He stands briefly under the shelter's edge, letting the rain touch his hands, grounding himself in sensation rather than memory. When night falls, the storm eases, leaving behind a sky washed clean. Stars emerge, sharp and numerous. He lies back against the ground, staring upward, thinking about how small individual conflicts seem beneath such vastness. The realization is not humbling in a diminishing way, but freeing. He does not need to carry the weight of the world. Only his own actions matter here. As summer approaches fully, Tommy recognizes that he has crossed an invisible threshold. He is no longer merely surviving aftermath. He is building continuity. The difference is subtle but profound. He still prepares for hardship, still respects danger, but his motivations have shifted. Fear no longer drives his decisions. Purpose does. When he closes the door at night, it is not to barricade himself from imagined threats, but simply to rest. The man who once refused to die has learned something more difficult: how to live without fighting. Summer settles fully over the land, bringing with it long days that blur together in steady rhythm. Tommy wakes before sunrise out of habit, though daylight already lingers in the sky, pale and persistent. The forest hums now, with life rather than threat. Insects buzz, birds argue loudly over territory, and the river runs calmer after spring's aggression. He moves through these sounds without resistance, letting them exist around him rather than scanning them for danger. His mornings begin with routine maintenance, checking the garden first, then tools, then the perimeter. The plants have taken root, green shoots pushing confidently upward, evidence that the soil accepts his presence. Watching them grow offers a quiet satisfaction he once would have dismissed as irrelevant. Now it feels essential. Midday heat forces adjustments. He works earlier and later, resting during the hottest hours beneath shade, repairing smaller items or sharpening blades slowly. The urgency that once defined his movements is gone. Precision remains, but it is calm rather than violent. Occasionally, distant aircraft pass overhead, faint and uninterested, reminders that the modern world still moves far above his chosen existence. He does not look up immediately when he hears them. He finishes what he is doing first. That small delay feels like victory. One afternoon, smoke appears faintly on the horizon, thin and controlled. Tommy studies it carefully. It does not spread, does not behave like wildfire. Someone else is out there, managing land, making choices similar to his own. The realization does not disturb him. Instead, it reinforces that isolation does not equal absence of humanity. Others are rebuilding too, in their own ways. Days later, while collecting water, he encounters evidence of shared paths. A broken fence repaired crudely, a marker placed near a bend in the trail. Someone has been thoughtful enough to guide rather than dominate. Tommy respects that impulse. He leaves no sign of his own presence in response. Not secrecy, simply preference. As summer advances, he begins crafting improvements rather than repairs. Storage spaces expand, shelves added with careful measurements. He constructs a small smokehouse near the river, planning ahead for preservation once autumn arrives. Each project is completed fully before another begins, a discipline he once applied to missions but now uses for sustainability. In the evenings, he sits outside more often, letting the day cool gradually instead of retreating indoors immediately. The fire is smaller now, less necessary for warmth and more for atmosphere. Flames flicker without urgency. During one such evening, a fox wanders close to the clearing, watching him without fear. They observe each other briefly before it moves on, unthreatened. Tommy smiles faintly, recognizing mutual understanding. Trust without expectation. As weeks pass, a pattern emerges. He is no longer counting days. Time has lost its sharp edges. Memories of pursuit, explosions, and bloodshed surface less frequently. And when they do, they arrive without control over his body. He does not tense or brace. He acknowledges them and lets them pass. Like weather, physical training continues, but it evolves. Instead of preparing for combat, he focuses on endurance and balance. maintaining capability rather than maximizing aggression. He swims in the river regularly, letting cold water strengthen muscles while clearing his mind. The water carries him gently now, not dragging him toward survival. One morning, distant voices carry faintly through the trees. Laughter, casual, unguarded. Otami pauses, listening. It does not sound like pursuit or patrol. He chooses not to approach. The sound fades on its own, leaving behind a sense of reassurance rather than tension. Human life exists nearby, but it does not demand confrontation. This coexistence feels new, fragile, yet promising. Later that week, a storm builds suddenly, summer lightning cracking sharply across the sky. The rain comes hard and brief, drenching everything before retreating just as quickly. He watches from the doorway, appreciating the unpredictability without resenting it. Once the storm passes, he inspects damage, finding none of significance. Preparedness has paid off. The house stands firm. The garden survives intact. His systems work. That realization brings deeper satisfaction than any victory ever did. Toward the end of summer, he begins thinking about winter again, not with dread, but with respect. Supplies are calculated carefully. He adjusts quantities based on experience rather than fear. There is confidence now, earned through consistency. One evening, as the sun sets later than expected, casting long shadows across the clearing, he reflects on identity. For years, he was defined by refusal to die, by resilience sharpened into legend. Now, that title feels incomplete. Survival is no longer rebellion. Living well is he no longer measures success by endurance alone, but by balance. His home reflects that shift. Functional, but not barren. Secure, but not hostile. As autumn approaches subtly, leaves beginning to dull at their edges, Otami understands that his journey has entered a quieter phase. Not an ending, but still. The violence that once chased him has burned itself out, leaving behind space rather than emptiness. He fills that space deliberately, thoughtfully, without rush. When night falls, he lies down without scanning the darkness for threats. The forest watches over itself. He belongs to it now, not as a conqueror or exile, but as a participant. The man who once moved only forward under fire now allows himself to remain. Stillness no longer feels dangerous. It feels earned. Autumn arrives quietly, not with sudden cold, but with subtle shifts that Otami notices immediately. The air sharpens in the mornings, carrying a scent of damp leaves and distant frost, and the forest changes color almost overnight, greens surrendering to muted golds and rusted reds. He adjusts his routine without thinking, waking slightly later, conserving energy as daylight shortens. Tasks that once stretched across the day are now prioritized carefully. Heavy labor finished early, while warmth still lingers. He harvests what the land offers with patience, storing roots and dried herbs methodically, ensuring nothing goes to waste. Each movement reflects experience rather than anxiety. The smokehouse becomes central now, thin streams of smoke rising steadily, preserving meat for months ahead. He monitors the fire closely, maintaining balance between heat and restraint, understanding that excess ruins more than it saves. While working, memories surface again, sharper in the cooling air. Cold has always carried echoes of war, of marches and ambushes under frozen skies. This time, however, those memories do not demand reaction. They coexist with the present, layered rather than invasive. He allows them space without surrendering to them. One afternoon, while checking traps farther from home, he encounters tracks that do not belong to animals. Human boots, recent but unhurried, moving parallel to his path before veering away. Someone knows this territory well enough to avoid conflict. Otami studies the impressions carefully, reading intention rather than threat. He feels no urge to follow. Respect is mutual, even without meeting. As the weeks pass, storms become more frequent. Rain lingers longer, soaking into soil already heavy with moisture. He reinforces drainage paths around the house, preventing erosion, adapting rather than resisting. During one particularly long storm, thunder rolling low and constant, he remains indoors for most of the day, repairing clothing, reinforcing seams, and sharpening tools by hand. The rhythmic sound of rain becomes background rather than interruption. In moments of quiet, he finds himself thinking about his family, not with pain but with clarity. Faces emerge more distinctly now, details once blurred by rage and survival. He remembers small habits, expressions, ordinary moments that violence could not erase. These memories no longer fuel anger. They anchor him. Later that month, while transporting supplies from a distant cache, he notices a structure partially hidden among trees. Old, abandoned, but recently stabilized. Someone has claimed it quietly, reinforcing walls without altering its original form. Atomi stops at a distance, observing no smoke, no sound. Whoever lives there understands discretion. He marks the location mentally, not as a target, but as knowledge. Information remains useful, even when violence does not. As nights grow colder, he begins sleeping deeper, waking fewer times. The constant alertness that once governed his rest has softened. When he does wake, it is usually too simple discomfort or natural sound, not imagined pursuit. He corrects his posture, adjusts blankets, and returns to sleep easily. This ease surprises him at first, but soon becomes familiar. One clear evening, the sky opens wide, stars sharp and countless. He sits outside longer than usual, wrapped against the cold, letting the fire burn low. The silence is complete, broken only by distant wind through branches. In that stillness, he acknowledges a truth he has avoided. He is no longer preparing for anything specific. There is no enemy anticipated, no escape planned. The future exists as continuity, rather than confrontation. This realization does not frighten him. It feels honest. The following day, while gathering wood, he injures his hand slightly, a shallow cut that bleeds more than expected in the cold. He cleans and binds it carefully, recognizing vulnerability without resentment. Healing takes longer now, but he is not rushing anywhere. Time allows recovery. As autumn deepens, he notices animals migrating or storing food, each following instinctive cycles. He mirrors them naturally, aligning his preparations with theirs. There is comfort in this shared rhythm. Survival no longer feels solitary. Even when alone, he is part of something ongoing. Near the season's end, early snow dusts the ground briefly before melting away. He watches it fall, without tension, understanding it as rehearsal rather than warning. His supplies are sufficient. His shelter is strong. His body, though scarred, is capable. More importantly, his mind is steady. When winter comes, it will not arrive as an enemy. It will simply be another phase. On the last clear day before heavier cold sets in, he walks the perimeter one final time, not to search for threats, but to acknowledge space. The land feels familiar now, almost conversational. He returns home before dusk, closes the door gently, and lights the fire. As warmth fills the room, he feels no need to define himself anymore. He exists, and that is enough. The man who once survived through refusal now lives through acceptance. Autumn fades outside, but inside, balance holds. Winter settles fully this time, not hesitantly but with quiet certainty, transforming the land into something both harsher and cleaner. Snow blankets the ground evenly, softening edges and muting sound until movement itself feels deliberate and meaningful. Atomi adapts without resistance, rising with the pale morning light that filters weakly through frost-coated windows. The cold no longer feels like a test. It is a condition, one he understands intimately. His breath forms steady clouds as he moves through practiced routines, feeding the fire, checking stored supplies, stepping outside only when necessary. Each action is measured, conserving strength while maintaining control. Days shorten further, darkness arriving early, yet the nights feel less oppressive than before. Inside, the fire becomes a companion rather than a necessity. Its glow steady and reassuring. He spends hours maintaining equipment, reinforcing what time and weather may weaken. Not out of fear, but respect for inevitability. The forest remains alive beneath the snow. Tracks appear clearly now, revealing patterns otherwise hidden. He reads them effortlessly, recognizing hunger, caution, and migration written plainly on the ground. Occasionally, distant gunfire echoes faintly across frozen terrain, a reminder that others still resolve conflict through noise and urgency. He does not investigate. That world operates parallel to his own, not intersecting. One afternoon, while repairing a section of roofing damaged by accumulated ice, he slipped slightly, catching himself before falling. The moment lingers longer than expected. He pauses, gripping the edge, heart steady but aware. Balance, he realizes, is no longer something he can assume indefinitely. Instead of dismissing the thought, he accepts it, adjusting his movements carefully thereafter. This awareness does not weaken him. It sharpens his judgment. He reorganizes living spaces to reduce unnecessary strain, placing tools within easier reach, adjusting storage height. Adaptation becomes an act of intelligence, not surrender. As weeks pass, storms roll in heavier, snow piling high enough to alter familiar paths. He clears what he must, leaving the rest undisturbed. Isolation deepens naturally, yet loneliness does not accompany it. He fills silence with purposeful thought rather than memory. When thoughts of war emerge, they do so without command. They arrive as fragments, not narratives, sensations without urgency. He allows them to exist briefly, then lets them pass. This internal discipline feels different now, less like suppression and more like regulation. One night, during an especially violent storm, the wind howling relentlessly, the structure groans under pressure. He sits awake, listening, hand resting calmly on the table. There is no panic, only evaluation. When a beam shifts slightly, he reinforces it methodically, working by lantern light until stability returns. Afterward, he rests without exhaustion. The following morning reveals a landscape reshaped, drifts forming new barriers and openings. He studies the changes thoughtfully, memorizing routes anew. Midwinter arrives marked not by calendar, but by stillness. Even wildlife retreats deeper, movement reduced to necessity. During this period, he spends long stretches simply sitting, observing firelight, feeling warmth settle into bones, hardened by decades of cold. These moments are not idle. They feel earned. In that stillness, he reflects on the idea of legacy, not in terms of stories told or recognition earned, but in quieter continuity. The land will remember his presence only through subtle traces. Reinforced earth, cleared paths, altered growth patterns. That is enough. One clear morning, sunlight glinting sharply off snow, he steps outside and notices smoke rising faintly far beyond his perimeter. It is distant, thin, controlled. Someone else endures winter nearby. He acknowledges this silently, feeling no urge to approach or retreat. Shared survival does not require interaction. Later, while checking a distant trapline, he encounters a broken snare, deliberately cut rather than torn, a sign of respect rather than theft. He repairs it without irritation, understanding the message clearly. Boundaries are being observed. Trust exists without words. As winter nears its deepest point, his body begins to show subtle signs of wear. Stiffness lingering longer in the mornings, recovery taking extra hours. He adjusts nutrition accordingly, resting more, pushing less. Pride has no place here. Survival has evolved into sustainability. One evening, while preparing food, he pauses unexpectedly, struck by a sensation unfamiliar for years. Anticipation without threat. He is looking forward to something undefined, perhaps spring, perhaps simply continuation. This realization sits quietly, neither celebrated nor questioned. As days slowly lengthen again, almost imperceptibly, he notices changes first in light rather than temperature. Shadows shift slightly, mornings brighten earlier. These signs register immediately. Renewal does not surprise him, it confirms pattern. On the coldest night of the season, the sky clears completely, stars burning fiercely overhead. He steps outside briefly, letting the cold bite sharply, grounding him fully in the moment. He exhales slowly, feeling contentment settle deeper than warmth. The man who once survived through defiance now lives through understanding. Winter does not break him. It passes, as all things do. When he returns inside, closing the door gently behind him, he does so without urgency, without expectation. Life continues, not because he forces it forward, but because he allows it to move at its own pace.